Okay, everybody can hear me? Yay! Okay, so the idea of this came from working with stories that celebrated the old woman. We were working with cacao specifically, and cacao is nothing if she's not an old crone. She's been around for 10 million years, will be around for 10 million more, at least, hopefully, and has worked the same soil generation after generation after generation. And so she's a beast of the forest. She's super productive, she's super fertile, she has so many interactions and community help from her environment. And so, when we're talking about the personality of the cacao, or who this being is, then normally people think of her as an old lady. She has that grandmother energy. But she's not she is a gentle old soul, but she's not. She has that bitterness to her. The bitterness that we're all addicted to, emotionally, spiritually, socially, maybe not physically. But chocolate, or cacao, what she's become, is this mix between the sweet, but underneath there's always that bitterness. There's always that forest energy. There's always that side of her where you don't really know who she is or what's going on. And so out of that, I thought I would share a couple of stories about that personality, that archetype. Clarissa Pinkola Estes did an audio recording called The Dangerous Old Woman, and I was trying really hard to listen to it today, but she's so slow in her talking. And I was trying to come up with stories to do, but I think I'm going to do two. I'm going to do an old Greek story, and I'm going to do a Norwegian story. Apologies if you've heard the second one before, or the first one. So the first story is about a character called Baobab. The story is, the Greeks wrote it down. The first evidence of it being written down was about 3,000 years ago. So it's an old story. And every time we hear a story about an old woman that might be bitter, that might be sweet, there's very, very few stories about them. You have to listen. You have to listen through the story to see what you can hear of these characters. And that's because I think that they refer to much, much, much older stories, much, much older cultures where things were really different. And so, every time you hear about a witch in the story, you've got to listen to what the witch says. You've got to look at the context of where the witch is and see if there's an older message that's rippling underneath where the energy that she's coming with. So Baobab is a fragment in a bigger story. And that bigger story is called Demeter and Persephone. Demeter and Persephone is a story where, there's some stories that are archetypal, and there's some stories that are descriptors, explain stuff. And Demeter and Persephone is a story that explains winter and summer, light and darkness to the Greeks. Demeter is the goddess of grain. She's the goddess of summer and of harvest. And Persephone was her daughter. Persephone got stolen by her uncle as his bride. Her uncle was the Hades, the ruler of the underworld. And so the mother, Demeter, didn't know what happened to this young daughter. She was a teenager. Young daughter got taken away, disappeared completely. And so she scoured the earth looking for her daughter. And as she scoured the earth, she was asking anyone she could meet, do you know what happened to my daughter? She was in the meadow. She's gone. I have no trace of her. Finally, the sun was forced to tell her what he'd seen. That Hades had come up in his chariot, the earth had opened, he'd snatched Persephone, and he'd disappeared. The ground closed behind him. So Demeter was understandably furious, and she went to Zeus, who was Hades' brother and the father of Persephone, and demanded that he make Hades give her daughter back. Zeus refused because he had done this deal with his brother, and Demeter was crestfallen, and she started wandering the earth. Now, when the goddess of the grains and the harvest stops doing her job, things don't go so well. Things start dying. The harvest is no more. The grain doesn't grow. There's no abundance in the land. There's no fertility in the land. And so people began to be hungry and sad and scared. It looked like the end of the world was happening. There was no food. There was no growth. There was nothing going on. And finally, Demeter decided that she would walk the earth. She was so grief-stricken and she was so sorrowful that she wanted to be amongst the people. She wanted to be amongst human beings and see their sorrow and their feelings of loss and feelings of grief. And so she took on the disguise of an old woman and she went down and walked amongst the people. She was in a place called Elysis, which later became famous because of her. And she went to the well. So now we're into the fragment of the story that I want to tell you. So she walked up to the well and she's sitting there watching the young women come and take water from the well and go back to their houses. Not just young women, women of all ages, shapes, sizes. And a woman came with a baby, a newborn baby. And she was struggling holding the baby and taking the water out of the well. And Demeter was looking at the baby, and it was a girl, and she was thinking, I remember when I was a young mother, and I remember struggling with my baby too. And so she said to the woman, are you in need of assistance? I can help you with your child. And the woman was in such a flux that she said, yes, of course, that would be great. And so Demeter took this crying baby from her and held her. The baby quietened down straight away. And the woman noticed that there was something special about this woman, and she invited her back to her house. So it turns out that the woman is not just a regular woman gathering water from the well. She is the wife of a wealthy merchant, possibly the richest man in the town. And so she employs Demeter as a nanny for her child. And Demeter, this enormous goddess, this incredibly powerful being, takes on the work of being a nanny. But she's so sad. She's always sad. The people of the village, the people of the town, including the merchant and his family, are talking about what terrible things are happening in the world. You know, where is the summer? What happened to the rain? Why aren't the crops growing? People are dying. People are having a terrible time. And Demeter is listening to all this. And she sees herself reflected in the stories. Of course, the stories are about her, really. But she hears herself, her own loss, and her own longing, and her own sadness reflected in the stories. And instead of making her think, I can help these people, she becomes so lost in her own tragedy. Every night she takes the baby. She's really fond of the baby. Reminds her of her own daughter. She takes the baby and she builds a sacred fire. And she dips the baby into the fire every evening. Now, during the day, she's miserable. And they decide that they have to do something. They decide they have to find out the story of this woman. Why she's so upset. And so they try and tell her stories. They try and ask her questions. They try and make her laugh. They try everything that they can to help Demeter, to make her smile, to make her stop sighing. Now there was an old woman that lived in that town, and her name was Baob. Sometimes she's known as Ayam. And Baob was one of those old, strange characters in stories and fairy tales. Some people say that she was a hermaphrodite. Some people say that she was very small and she really had no torso. Her head sat on top of her pelvis. Now one day, Baob came to the house of the merchant and she started telling the most rude jokes. She started telling about all of the sexual conquests that she'd ever had in her entire life. She started talking about the bees and the birds in the most explicit, ridiculous ways that she could imagine. And pretty soon after that, she started picking up her... I'm not going to do it, don't be afraid. She started picking up her skirts and dancing around. And as she danced around, and she became more and more grandiose in her gestures, her skirts came higher and higher and higher up, until she was completely exposing herself. You could see everything going on. And as she exposed herself, Demeter realized that she had a face inside her vagina. And the face was grimacing at her. And you won't believe what it was doing when it stuck out its tongue. And so Demeter saw this and she started to laugh. And she started to laugh, and she started to laugh, and she started to laugh. And as she started to laugh, strange things happened outside in the gardens. The flowers started to open. Rain began to fall. And as long as Demeter was laughing, the earth came back to life again. The grain started growing quickly, straight out of the seed, right up, green passing into yellow, passing into the time when it was harvested, or harvestable. And as long as Baob was dancing around the garden in the house, and as long as she was showing everything she got, and as long as she was telling those lewd jokes, then the earth became fertile again. And Demeter began to become more of herself. So they started inviting, they saw this was happening, they started inviting Baob back every day. And in that town at least, people began to harvest again. And everything became normal. Everything became as it was always in those months of the year. One night, the merchant's wife went in to check on her baby. And there was the sacred fire in the baby's room. And there was Demeter with the baby dipping it in the sacred fire. The wife exploded. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She thought the baby was being killed. And she yelled at Demeter. And Demeter said, "Ah, God, if you had only waited, if you had only waited one more day, if you had only trust for one more day, your daughter would have been immortal. But maybe it was not meant to be. I am done here. My time is done, and I am going to search for my daughter." And so she left. And finally, she did find her daughter. And they came to an agreement where Persephone could spend half of the year with her mother. Some stories it was a third of the year. Half the year with her mother and half the year with Hades. Now, that part with Baob in it isn't one that's told very often. Maybe for obvious reasons. But it's so beautiful because it's a link back to that dangerous old woman or crazy old lady or somebody with some deep sensuality, deep sexuality, and knows it and is able to use it. Baob knew she was an old goddess. Baob knew exactly who Demeter was and exactly how she could bring back Demeter's smile. And so, anytime that I'm taking myself too seriously, or anytime that I am being so very correct or so very proper, I like to think of that Baob story and just catch a little bit of that undercurrent, that sensuality, that sexuality, that life, those life forces that keep us going and that we have, no matter where we are in our lives or how old we are in